Estoy muy feliz a estar aquí y es una buena oportunidad a discutir un problema muy grande para el mundo, para todo. Y puedo hablar español un poco, pero probablemente es mejor para mí y para tuyos desde ahora a hablar en inglés. So there's a group of us that have been traveling through South America. We've spent a week or so at a conference in the north of Brazil. Okay. Lo siento. So there's a group of us from Melbourne who've been at a conference in the north of Brazil and Fortaleza, and then we spent time at a workshop near Sao Paulo working with people from the University of Sao Paulo and from the universities here in Chile, from the CR2, talking about these issues of adaptation to climate change. And I guess one of the key themes that's come through those discussions has been drought. Brazil is in a major drought, quite unprecedented. Chile is going through drought problems, and we'll discuss some of the issues associated with drought today. So. So just running through the outline of my talk, I might stand around here so I can see. I'll talk a little bit about the Australian environment, the nature of climate change that's being projected for Australia, some of the impacts that we're experiencing already and some of the projected impacts, and then talk about adaptation and the role of government. Okay.
The other one, there. Sorry.
Off with that. Okay, so Australia's climate is characterised by variability, and this is a poem from one of our famous poets that's often used in Australia to describe the variability. I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of ragged mountain ranges, of drought and flooding rains. And I guess for many Australians that really captures the spirit of the Australian environment. It's hot, dry, but the climate is very variable. It's also quite a flat continent. Soils are old, heavily weathered, and plant production is really limited by nutrients and the availability of water. Fire is a significant force in our environment. It's been part of the environment for a very long period of time. Many of the plant species are adapted and actually depend on fire for regeneration. But because of that variability, plant growth is often very opportunistic. They respond quickly when the conditions are right, but can often survive through periods of long periods without rain. We've also had a long history of Indigenous occupation by Indigenous people, and they've shaped the continent very strongly through the use of fire. So managed fire has also been a part of the Australian environment. But 220 years of European settlement has again changed the landscape considerably. There's been a lot of clearance of forests, conversion to agriculture, urbanisation, and other forms of land degradation that have changed the environment. So our current population is about 23 million people. 90% of those live in urban areas, and they live in urban areas very close to the coast, along the east coast, the big cities in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, and the rest of the continent is very sparsely populated, very dry and sparsely populated. We're quite a wealthy country globally. GDP is about 2.5 times that of Chile. So some similarities with the Chilean environment in terms of the latitude, but also quite different. So the effects of climate change that we're seeing so far is increasing heat. So this is the number of record hot days per decade, and you can see here that there's been a gradual increase with a big jump between 2000 and 2010 in heat waves. And that's resulting in the last year record heat in many different parts of the country. So we're seeing temperature records broken In Melbourne, we had 4 days in a row over 41 degrees C, which was unprecedented. And I'll talk a bit more about the impacts of those later, but very dry conditions in northern Australia, which again are quite unusual, and but heat occurring all over the country. And for a country that's already hot, significant increases in heat are going to drive our human and natural systems over some thresholds. So the kinds of climate impacts we've been experiencing in the last 10 or 15 years or so, we had a very long drought in southeastern Australia from 1997 to 2009, and that had significant economic impacts and social impacts. Our agricultural production dropped by about 10%, or the value of production, and there were many impacts on people living in the landscape. Also significant impacts on our water resources for cities. So the storages in Melbourne and Sydney were at record lows, and the cities were faced with running out of water, and I'll talk a bit more about the responses. So in 2009 we had a period of very hot conditions, a heat wave for about 5 days that caused significant damage to infrastructure, but it was also estimated that 370 people died during that heat wave. Additional deaths, mainly older people and people suffering from diseases. And after that period of heat wave, we had very high winds and significant fire, so bushfire. So that, as you've had just here in Valparaiso recently, fire, we had over 2,000 houses burnt around the outskirts of Melbourne, and 174 people died. But then that El Nino condition flipped over into La Nina, and as typically happens in Australia, at the end of a very long drought, we get floods. And so we had significant flooding, record flooding in Queensland and in Victoria. And in Queensland, about 35 people died, and Paulina will talk more about that, I think, later. So, major challenges, not those that are not faced by other countries, but we're certainly dealing with many of those things. So these are the projections from the latest IPCC report, the fifth assessment report. So the projections are that we're likely to see further decreases in the southern part of Australia in rainfall, longer periods of dry, and particularly in southwestern Australia, where they're already suffering severe climate shortage, rainfall deficits. Rising sea levels and increased rainfall are going to cause problems with coastal flooding and inundation, and I think Alyssa will talk about some adaptation responses to that, and impacting on ecosystems, but also infrastructure, and many of our coastal housing is very close to the coast. And increasing heat waves and changing patterns of disease will impact on human health. I've got some water here actually. And we're going to see shifts in our agricultural production zones as rainfall decreases and as the temperature patterns change. Many of our native species will also be impacted. They often have quite narrow temperature ranges, and they're likely to be moving across the landscape, and there are barriers to that, which means that they'll potentially face extinction. So the key risks that have been identified out of that are to our natural systems. The coral reef systems are already suffering significant bleaching from rising ocean temperatures, and the potential for increased ocean acidification is likely to cause problems. We do have some high mountain systems, even though we're a flat continent, and because of the temperature rises, they're not very high, so the species that exist in these sort of alpine conditions are likely to be lost because there's really no place for them to move to. Constraints on water resources, increased impacts of human health with heat, increasing incidence and intensity of wildfire, and these risks to coastal infrastructure, and likely significant reduction in our agricultural production, particularly in this area we call the Murray-Darling Basin, a very large catchment area that supplies about 80% of our agricultural production, of the value of our agricultural production. But as I said, many of our cities are coastal and low-lying areas and are likely to be impacted by changing sea levels. I mean, it's not all bad. There are some potential benefits from a changing climate. We could see reduced mortality in winter due to cold, reduced energy demand for heating, possibly increased forest growth in some of those areas where it's temperature limited and where the nutrients and rainfall are appropriate, and increased pasture growth in some agricultural areas. So this is the work from the AR5 that's describing our adaptive capacity. Australia is a wealthy country with relatively well-diversified economy, and the adaptive capacity generally is considered high, and it's been increasing because we have seen significant investment in education and in research and in changing a number of our systems. So I'll talk a little bit about those. But there are significant constraints on implementing adaptation. So there is a lack of consistent information about the potential impacts, and there's a high degree of uncertainty, particularly for things like rainfall, where the projections are, because of where we're situated in the oceanic environments, there's a lot of uncertainty about future rainfall projections. So some of the models are saying 40% decrease in rain, others are saying no change. So there's a fair bit of uncertainty about that. There's limited financial and human resources at the local level. So our local governments, which are often facing the most significant challenges in this, whether it's around infrastructure or land use planning or managing vegetation, don't have the resources to deal with these problems. And we're seeing a lack of effective coordination between different levels of government. So we say in Australia that we have a three-tier system: federal, state and local. Federal government has the power, federal government has the money, state governments have the power, but local governments have the problems. And getting coordination between those three is quite challenging. And there are, of course, many different attitudes towards the risks. We see, we have quite a significant group of people, including some of those that are in power in government at the moment, who are denying that climate change is actually a problem. So there is a real lack of leadership in some parts of government about this issue, and a recognition of the potential risks. And of course, I'll talk about this a bit more too, but values are very important in this. Whose values count, what things we should try and protect. We do have a significant Indigenous population, as I said, and they are considered to be more highly exposed. They have a long history of management of the landscape, so they do have a relatively high adaptive capacity in terms of their understanding. And they have a strong community bond and sharing ethic, so that gives them some benefits. But because of their economic situation, their social status, and their conditions, they're living in often remote environments where they're not able to get much support, they're considered at higher risk. So moving on to the role of government, there is considerable debate about this. Some consider that climate change adaptation is really a private issue, and that all government needs to do is provide information and about the future climate conditions and what some of the adaptation options might be, and then it's up to individuals or companies to make decisions according to their local circumstances. Whereas others feel that there's and that all governments need to do in this situation is provide a diverse and resilient economy, well-functioning markets for things like insurance, which are risk management tools. But others feel that there is an important role for government. Issues such as building standards, land use planning and zoning rules, changing institutional structures so that there's better coordination, undertaking national assessments so that we know what the risks are and how we might address them, increased emergency management, preparedness and response, and assistance to help the private sector through large-scale catastrophes. And in particular, government needs to look after its own assets and infrastructure, public infrastructure. But there's also public goods such as our national parks and other natural ecosystems that government needs to focus on and protect. So I'll talk briefly about Victoria. So this is where our work has been focused through VCCCAR over the last 5 years. It contains about a quarter of the Australian population, 5.8 million people, in this relatively small area compared to the rest of the country. It's going through relatively rapid population growth, but it's also an ageing population. As I heard here in Chile, the population is also ageing as well. A diversified economy, mainly focused around services, manufacturing and education, a big contributor here. We get many Chilean students coming out to study in Melbourne and other universities in Victoria. But we don't have the mining. We had our mining boom about 120 years ago, so compared to the rest of Western Australia and Queensland that are going through a mining boom at the moment. And a key point is we have our energy system is brown coal, and we have high greenhouse gas emissions per capita. So some of the responses that we've seen in Victoria to the threats that I identified before, we've been able, around our water resources, we've been able to reduce consumption. We've actually spent a lot of money building a desalination plant, which was highly controversial, and we're still paying for that. We'll be paying for it for about 30 years. But at that point they were running out of water, so it was a tough decision for government. But we're seeing increasing attention to water recycling, recovery and reuse, and water-sensitive urban design. And we've seen upgrades in our transport infrastructure, our abilities to address heat waves with warnings, and improve communication and health support, and better arrangements in our emergency services. So the Victorian government has recently, about a year ago, produced its first adaptation plan under the Climate Change Act that was passed under the previous government. The government is required to produce a plan every 5 years, and essentially these are some of the estimates that we've been spending a large amount of money, $4 billion on response over the last 10 years on response and recovery to climate-related events. And this plan really aims to provide informed decision-making, a risk-based approach, building complementarity with other levels of government, and equitable approaches that address the differing capacities across communities and regions. So one of the responses that the government had was to establish VCCCAR, which is a centre that's focused on providing information to support government decision-making at both state and local levels. So we were funded for 5 years, $1 million a year, not a large amount of money, but it's a partnership between Victorian universities that is very much focused on working with government. So where our research priorities are developed by government, and our projects actually involve researchers in teams between government agencies or service providers and the researchers. And the main goal is to facilitate institutional learning. So it's really about providing information that helps organisations learn about the risks and how to manage them. And we produce our outputs in a range of different ways. So we've developed 14 projects as part of our research program around the policy, governance and implementation, decision-making under uncertainty, urban resilience and natural resource management. So I did have a couple of examples, but I'm running out of time. So I just wanted to flag that we've had work going on to reduce the urban heat island effect, and that's how to implement green infrastructure, street trees, parks, other forms of vegetation, green roofs, green walls in cities in order to reduce the rising heat that's coming about through increasing urban densification and higher temperatures. So we had an integrated approach where we assessed heat at various scales, from the metropolitan scale down to the city level to street level. And then the policy responses that were identified needed to be multifaceted across both different levels of government and across different departments. And another project, we work closely with community service organisations. So these are organisations that are charged with delivering government services, either healthcare services or other forms of support to disabled people or other people in the communities. So we work closely with these organisations to identify their needs, and then we worked with 5 organisations more closely, including organisations in regional areas, where they identified a tool which they could use to improve their planning, and they produced a handbook for their partner agencies. It was written in their own words, so the people from the organisation wrote the handbook that had regionally specific information that was relevant to the needs of their members. And then as part of that process, they were able to outline the business case, how they would save money in the future by investing in adaptation ahead of time. And that was based on understanding the policy context and assessing the effects of climate change. So I'll just finish off with a couple of learnings and challenges from our work over the last 5 years. So adaptation is really often considered at the end of the food chain in climate science. You start with the climate science, the big global models and regional downscaling, and then people look at what the impacts of that might be on ecosystems or human systems. And then at the end of that, people look at what the adaptation options might be. But increasingly we see that the focus needs to go back the other way, that we need to understand what our vulnerabilities and sensitivities are in different parts of our systems, and then tailor the climate science so it's actually addressing those sensitivities. Because much of the climate information that's being produced, whether it's average temperature or long-term projections, isn't actually that useful. Science in a way that's useful for decision making. The other thing we discovered is that adaptation is often considered a knowledge deficit problem. So all you have to do is provide the information to people and they will automatically absorb it and know the right thing to do. But increasingly we're seeing it's a multifaceted issue. As Paulina said in her introduction, you need to have a range of people around the table discussing the problem, and many of those people can actually view the problem. In this case, that might look to you like a 3, but the person sitting here might think it's how do you pronounce this? Or tres. Right. So many problem in different ways, and that's what happens when you start discussing adaptation. If you bring a climate scientist or a social someone from industry together, they all consider the problem quite differently. So we've shown that we can work together in teams across universities and with government. Research is improving practice. There's a strong demand for knowledge exchange, so many people feel we have enough knowledge, but what we need to do is have tools in which we can implement that knowledge. And, but working at this interface with government requires particular skills, and it's not really for everyone. So I'll just put up that last slide, and you can read through that, some of our challenges, and I think we'll discuss those later in the day. Muchas gracias.